Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you to all of the witnesses. It's almost an impossible task in terms of the enormity of what we have ahead of us in terms of scrutinising this legislation. And it's an enormous responsibility on us all to make sure that we come out with the best legislation possible that serves to give us a system that's as fit for purpose. But the key issues that we're facing in the legislation is striking the right balance. That's the right balance between the department and the HEA, the right balance between the HEA and the Institutes of Higher Education, the right balance between the governing authorities and the chief executives, and indeed the right balance between the external and internal members of the governing bodies. But on top of this, we have to strike the right balance and representation and competency on the boards and the governing authorities, as well as between accountability and the institutional autonomy. Now, the accountability is obviously paramount in all areas where we spend public money. However, this does not have and should not come at the expense of institutional autonomy, as was said. The submissions rightly highlight the fact that the sector has been starved of funding for over a decade, and that the legislative reform alone will not deliver the change that we need to see in higher education and in research. My first question is around the IUA and the THEA submission touch on the impact of this legislation that it could have on the ability of the institutes to borrow. How do these deficits and how these deficits and the debts are treated? And what do you see as the risk with this legislation in terms of existing university debt? And what do you see the impact will be in terms of the ability to borrow in the future? That's my first question. The second one is around the size of the governing bodies that was touched on. And the view of the minister is that they should be far smaller, as we said. I know there's demands on members of the governing body already, and that those demands are substantial. And my question is there a risk that we would be overtaxing unpaid members of the governing authority to ask a substantially smaller group to do the same job and even to take on additional functions? So maybe because I really want to have time for you to answer those. Possible, those two.
Thank you, Deputy. I mean, I think the enormity of the challenge is one that certainly would resonate with me. I think we need to remember that there are members on the committee here who weren't born. Sadly, I'm not one of those when the existing legislation was formulated in 1971. So I think we'll be living with this for a very long time, and it's really important that we get it right. I think your question really speaks to the heart of it. I think how we strike that right balance. I think the question on the borrowing is that there's almost €1 billion borrowed by 7 of our 8 members at the moment. That is off the state balance sheet because of the way that is treated, and it's really got to do, there's a fairly complex process around that. There's a CSO and Eurostat, as you're aware, are involved in. But it essentially, it's very much related to the level of control that the state have on the sector. And I think if the state exercises greater control through this legislation, I think there's a real risk that that existing loans would be cast onto the state balance sheet, and then that in turn would impair the capacity of the sector to borrow in future. So I think we need to get that balance right. I think it is possible to get the legislation framed in a way that that balance is right, but I think it's important that that line is not overstepped. I'll cede to my colleagues, but on the size of the GAs, I mean, we've suggested a range. I think it's important that we very strongly support a competency-based approach, but perhaps some flexibility on the range in size might be the way, because different institutions also, we need to recognise, may require different sizes depending on their scale and complexity.
Thank you.
Thanks. If I may, Chair, just come in a supplemental on that, and thanks, Deputy Conway-Walsh, for your questions and for your constant interest in education, which I really appreciate, as with Senator Byrne. You make the point about accountability. Absolutely, when we're dealing with public monies, that's an absolute given. However, that concern shouldn't lead us into micromanagement of these institutions. That's probably one of the themes that's coming across. On the question of the impact of the legislation to borrow, we've just had this move, the technical move towards the Technological University of the Shannon, a really great day. We're looking at 5 technological universities at the start of next year. These will be, they're very nascent bodies at the moment. They're going to need time to build capacity. Our difficulties, we're not even able to get into the borrowing at the moment, and they're going to need that if they're going to meet the ambition that's set out in government policy through frameworks such as the Project Ireland 2040 and national plans. On the size of governing bodies, fully agree with you. That was the point I was making earlier on. It is becoming a very onerous role now. It's becoming actually more difficult to attract people to take this on. So I won't delay further on that other than to agree with the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So
for that,
that
has
I
will have to. I'm right. Okay, Councillor Hode, I will allow you in, and then I'll move on to the next questioner.
I'll be very brief. Just Deputy to say, I suppose I share the same concerns in relation to the reduction of the governing body, but I think it's important that we would recognise that it would embrace the voices of many contributors, and also I think that it would have strong representation from the region, because I think that's very important in the whole process. Thank you, Chair.